I want to welcome everyone and the audience. It's the kind of question that we now start receiving and we received in the other session is a sign of an engagement with all these ideas and with Gliso and with you and the idea of opacity. So welcome, Manthia. I think Noura introduced you enough to people. All I could add is that you're one of those people who makes theory easily digestible. You break down things in very simple way. You take very complex ideas, you make it very easy for us to drink like soup, a digestible one. So it's really one of your, and I recall, you know, our brother Bonaventure from Berlin, who said this first. I remember in one of our webinars. So welcome again. And I think it's, beside it being a great keynote address, an eye-opener to many things, but it's also most interesting is the point that you raised about how the French now, in a Hippocratic way, making all these points about post-colonial theory or about progressive Muslim critique or others, while all these ideas were debated then and that many of these Black writers, it's interesting how the French export theory to America, but then when it comes to post-colonial thinking is that they're really not in kind of in the same step with the development of post-colonial theories, whether it's in India, among the subalterns, or in the United States itself. So anyway, welcome. And I also want to welcome, there will be, I mean, I just want to assure all the attendees is that we will deal with the questions that are left over from the other session. So we'll deal with that. But first, I want to introduce two colleagues who will be like an interlocutor or people who will enter into a debate with you very briefly. They read the paper, they read some of these books that you refer to and ideas, whether Fanon, Gliso, Richard Wright, or MS Césaire. The first is my colleague, Elizabeth Giorgis, who is a professor at the University of Addis Ababa and soon to join us at the Africa Institute. She's now a senior fellow at the Africa Institute. She is an art historian, a theorist, and most important is just to highlight her book. I think there is enough about her in the pamphlet or the website, is that her book, Ethiopian Modernism in Ethiopia, or Ethiopian Modernism, that's published by Ohio University Press, is the winner of the best book in East African Studies of the African Studies Association. It was also a finalist of the so-called or formerly known as the Herskovits Award of the African Studies Association. It was also shortlisted for the African Studies Association of the UK. And it's really, I encourage everyone to really engage with it. It's one of these rare books and new books that are really engaging with the idea of modernism and modernity in the African context. Surafel Wondimu is also another Ethiopian colleague who is also at the University of Addis Ababa, but he's also an independent, I would call it like a theater director, an actor himself, who studied also, had a PhD in performance studies from University of Minnesota. He is also a fellow here. He is the inaugural Okwi Enwezo postdoctoral fellowship in critical humanities, visual culture, and art history. He is working on a book on the history of Ethiopian performance and theater. He has been engaged in many of these ideas. So I want to welcome the two. I'll start with Elizabeth. If you briefly outline any kind of response or dialogue or comments as you wish or as you prepared, and then we'll go to Surafel and then we'll take it from there. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you, Manthia. I'm going to call you Manthia, not Professor Manthia. So I hope you don't mind.
Always call me Manthia. Why you keep qualifying it? You
okay.
This lady for a long time, old friend.
Just to be formal, it's a formal event, that's why. Anyway, I really did not know much about Glissant before the past few days when I read your works on Glissant to prepare for this talk. Most of us are very familiar with Fanon rather than Glissant. And it was a great learning experience for me. And from the little I have read and the paper that we received yesterday, I've quickly found out how Glissan's opacity, relationality, and difference can relate to my own work. And I definitely need to further study his works and your fascinating writings on his works, which really opens up the opacity of his works. So as you have said in some of your works on Glissa, you use difference, not as, quote, I quote you, oppositional or the exchange between contrary elements, but as that which is necessary for defining the beauty of the world. It's the relation between differences that keeps the world going, keeps it alive. So you say, for Glissa, truth, beauty, aesthetics, all come out of the relation between differences, unquote. So, and that the poem is the only dimension that connects the world, that can find the creativity of the world, which he says Fanon had dismissed. So instead, as you've just said in your talk, Fanon demanded clarity and transparency, which, as you said, by demanding clarity, is unable to reach the truth, but a shaved off truth. So from what I understand, I think you're saying there will never be clarity, but there are fragments of truth that are relational. And these fragments are opaque, always reproducing and creating other truths. So for Glissa, poetry opens the imagination to this opacity. So poetry is not ideological, but opaque, that reproduces identities and multiplicities of truths in these identities. So he's insinuating Fanon thought through ideology, which is linguistically colonized. So I'm bringing all this just to make my question clear and what my question's clear. So I'm just giving a synopsis of where I'm going, where I'm going to head to. So poetry is also buried in the sea, like you said earlier, in the abyss, when slaves were transported and systems emerged. Oppositional discourses, he said, took place, which he says, or you said, have contributed into threatening diversities, which remove any sense of poetry and imaginary from our differences. So my questions, they're all interrelated. So maybe I should ask them all and then you can comment on that. It's like 3 questions. So my questions therefore are, what does ideology mean to Glissa? If ideology is bringing ideas to practice, and if we want to situate poetry as an imaginative idea to bring about relationality, the idea, which is poetry, and relationality, which is the practice, does that not need a certain transporting mechanism, a certain ideology, so to speak? We can call it something else, but it needs a certain mechanism. So, or is ideology seen only through relations of power? So how do we bring about this relationality that Glissa talks about? How, for instance, as an Ethiopian, connect or relate to the Martinican when our languages, our cultures, our experiences are so different? What is this mechanism that will help us connect with each other, that will bring our relational difference, so to speak, to light? So, though Glissa is critiquing Fanon's materialist analysis of culture, the second question is not culture part of the material world we're living in? And was not Fanon imaginative in his own works, particularly in The Wretched of the Earth? I have, for instance, used Fanon's understanding of myth, which he says identifies him in describing Iskandar Bogosian, one of the Ethiopian modernists, and his fascination with myths and ancestral spirits. So how does Fanon's work stifle the imaginary? Is Fanon not talking about the poetics of relation in otherness? That's the second one. The third one is, when you were talking earlier, I just devised this question. I don't know if it's going to make sense, but you were talking about national culture and what Fanon's perception of national culture was. So, okay, so it may be contentious to think through Fanon's sense of national culture at the present moment, in contemporary moments of struggle, where the means and ends of struggle itself is so contested. So what I'm trying to say is that for Fanon, national culture is tied to the struggle of the nation. The problem now is the multiple understandings of the nation itself. Where I come from was a political quagmire we're in. The imagination of the nation itself is engulfed with the imagination of ethnic identities. So the construction of the national culture becomes problematic here. So that said, when Fanon was talking about national culture, he's saying we have to have a certain ideology or some kind of praxis to understand or to implement a certain solidarity to free the mind from the colonial psyche. So build a nation that does not go back to nativist discourse, to the authentic, to the mythical, etc., but build a new nation that's anti-colonial, that represents the present moment. So that, for me, that can maybe, we're formed that way. That can only be attained with a certain type of ideology.
Yeah.
So how do we bring about the transnational solidarity of the, Glissat is talking about the transnational solidarity of the formerly colonized through the humanistic inquiry, unless we confront power? Can we confront power only through humanistic inquiry? And if so, how? These are my questions. And from the little knowledge I have of Glissat that I got. So, so we can go to, I'm done, Salah.
So should I go, Salah, or you want to go to Surafel first, or how should we proceed? Should we attempt some response to this and we come back, or?
I think so. I think you should go ahead, and so people won't forget the question. I think the questions are all interesting. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and they're so powerful. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer coherently, cogently, because Glissant believed that all ideologies have failed, and capitalism is an ideology, and capitalism will fail. This is what one of the things that Glissant comes up with, and that we have to get away from what he called continental thinking. You know, continental thinking on the one hand is a thinking that's linear. You know, you go someplace, you discover it, you conquer it, it becomes a territory, it becomes a nation, it belongs to you. That's continental thinking, whether it is, especially in Europe, with all the trips discovering the world and the world become theirs, but also in most continents, people think in that kind of unified manner, as opposed to a rhizomic, as opposed to a nomadic manner where you use space. And so Glissant talks about that, but he believed that many of these ideologies are also oppressive. They are making people do things against their will. I think you summarized some of these things. I don't need to go too much about them. But Glissant believed, well, to begin with Fanon, Glissant believed that Fanon was necessary. Fanon was urgent, and Fanon was talking about the emergent. He was urgent, and he was talking about the emergent. You know, he was doing what Glissant liked to call, beginning in the French thought with Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre called negritude poetry an anti-racist racism. It's a racism deployed against, well, you know, against racist. But since we have the word race in it, it was bound someday to reach its limits, and for Sartre, therefore, to join the proletariat. This is what both Glissant in Philosophy of Knowledge and Glissant in Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask, Wretched of the Earth, goes against these white men defining our actions for us. You know, the white men being in this case Jean-Paul Sartre. Fanon also believed in, Glissant also believed in the rebel, and Fanon was a rebel. He believed in the deviant. He believed in the transgressive thinking, you know, the schizophrenic or any of these things. And with opacity, how to politicize this? I guess first the rebel. Glissant's argument is that the emergent, the emergency, the necessity of rebelling or the necessity of saying no to something. Again, I go back to music in Mali. There is a song, a fairly popular song that went with Malian independences in the 60s. And the song is basically called Bani, B-A-N-I, Bani. And Bani is a song, I think it was reprised by Didi Bridgewater in the maybe 2010 with some groups of Malian musicians. And and basically the song goes that say no and you make a better world, you know, and then they began to cite heroes who had said no and therefore made Mali a better place. And then, of course, he's saying no to colonialism, to imperialism, to all these things. So the rebels, and Gleason theorizes this with the Maroon. Gleason said the Caribbean failed in making the Maroons the national heroes. You know, because the Maroon were the first people who said no, and they went in the forest and they did detours as opposed to returns. So he writes very favorably about the Maroons, about the Rastafarians, and about the Trinidadian poet Kamal Braithwaite, and the Bajan poet. So Gleason, I'm trying to get at ideology, because ideology itself for Gleason is not poetic, and I think you summarized that very well. It's not patient with poetry, with nuances. It has to clearly trace something in a linear, unified manner. Gleason believed in the rebel, but he believed also that the rebel has to be willing to be surpassed by the revolution that they ignited. You know, when he started a revolution, he can't lead that revolution forever. And you know that history in Africa, you know it in the United States recently with Donald Trump and so on. He's a kind of rebel who just believed in his own popularity and all these things. So the rebel, but I'm sorry to lump Donald Trump and Fanon in the same thing. That's not what I meant at all. Fanon was necessary, was urgent, and gave his life to this revolution. But Gleason would say, and Gleason, because he's a contemporary of Salah. I was thinking about me and Salah, the same way Salah is my contemporary. So Gleason can criticize Fanon all the time. So one of the things he said is that Fanon was ill. He was neurotic by the French culture, French treatment of him, and Algeria cured him. Mm. You know, the French word he used was Fanon était perturbé, perturbed, and Algeria cured him. And by the way, Gleason also went all the way to Tunisia for sending messages to the Algerian rebels. So they're both in this struggle. So if I oppose them, it was not intentional because they were in the same struggle, and Gleason's passport was taken away from him. He stayed in Martinique. So unlike Fanon and Césaire, who was mayor for 50 years, who never talked about, who didn't want to talk about Martinique and independence, Gleason wanted Martinique independent. He said, if Martinique doesn't become independent, we don't produce anything, we import everything from France, we don't have a culture. You have to have a production in order to have a culture in many ways. So I didn't mean to oppose the two of them in many. So to come back to ideology, when and by the way, Gleason also was not against nationalism. He said, we need to break the walls that ban immigration. We need to we need to stop people from erecting the difference and surrounding them with walls against other people. I think you well summarized that too in your brief talk. But Gleason believed in nationalism because he said he rather liked the flavor of crossing. He didn't put it this way, I'm going to put this way. Let's say crossing from let's say from Sudan to Ethiopia, how the air, the food, and how to preserve these things. So nationalism in that sense, where people, certain cultural things need not die. We need to keep them alive. So he believed in nation in that sense. The example he gave is from Italy to France. You know, you leave Italy, you go to Nice, you are in a different place. Or you leave Nice, you go to another place. So Gleason thought that solidarity that was geared toward the survival of the living was very important, and perhaps we should create a politics of that solidarity, whether it is environment or whether it is against genocides or whether it is to mobilize people to do things. And so you entering in a space that Gleason would call a space defined by a politics and poetry. He didn't want to give up on poetry in no way, because once you give up poetry, then you are using these differences that are separated with knives, machetes, opposition, destruction of other people. If they're not like me, if I don't understand them, they're very bad. But I was gonna say one more thing about the rebel. Gleason actually preferred the transgressive, the schizophrenic, and the deviant to the rebel, because they are always either turning their back on the ideology or contesting. They are always contesting ideology, which, you know, is telling you this is what we have to do. This is the rationality. This is what has to govern us. That teleology, you know, beginning, middle, and end, Gleason was always opposing. And I'm sorry about the question on Fanon, if I gave the impression. Yes, Fanon believed in transparency, but, you know, I sent a film to Salah recently on Fanon, Mehdi Lalawi. And this is an incredible film on Fanon. And they interviewed me, and my point was, what is magnificent about Fanon when you read him in French? He was a poet. He was always poet. He was asking his body to question him, you know, because he did not know himself, you know. So I don't talk a lot about those here because I'm trying to, again, talk about opacity and deopacification. But Fanon's language was very, very poetic, also in a sense that this is a guy who writes and change personas, you know, from first person to second person to, so when you read the text, you see things that are, you know, always contradictory. And that is something beautiful about Fanon, his writing, and also his attempt. This is not just Fanon, but it was also Richard Wright. It was many, where they didn't want to be subsumed with the group. Because the biggest difficulty of Black intellectuals in the 40s after World War II and also in the 50s was that either you communist and you get subsumed completely by the Communist Party, or you Black and you become part of the Black identity. So your individuality was always denied. And Fanon, his conclusion in both Black Skin, White Mask and Wretched of the Earth is to try to raise questions about that freedom of the individual in many ways. So yes, Fanon had was very imaginative, and he also, maybe my paper is characteristic, it's kind of simplified if I gave the impression that Fanon did not raise the questions of either pan-Arabism or pan-Africanism. You know, in that essay, in Wretched of the Earth, the essay is called on national culture. He raises this. He just thought that it was urgent first to create a nation before we can connect to Pan-Arabism, because he's in Algeria, or Pan-Africanism. So, but he thought that those were very broad in the beginning. But later on, he had imagined, he's talking about imagination, he had imagined moving to these kind of larger entities in many ways. Yeah, I think I have talked about the third question indirectly, but we can come back to it.
Okay.
Yeah, because I have a tendency to just digress too much.
So, Surafel, because there is also a lot of questions from the audience, we want to be fair, but I also want to be fair to you. Go ahead, Surafel.
Thank you so much. Thank you. First, I would like to say that, I feel so privileged to have this conversation with you, Manthia Diawara. First, I'd like to just present my two reflections, how your ideas, your thinking with Glesson resonates with me. Your idea of opacity, particularly, even though it can be, understood in multiple ways, when you said that opacity, following Glesson, opacity at the bottom of the mirror, wherein we don't see the image of the white man, but a whole alluvium deposited by populations with an insistent presence that we are incapable of not experiencing. So we cannot not to experience it because it is here, the whole fragment, the whole room. I think this pretty much resonates with the whole, Okwi Inwezor's idea of thinking historically in the present. How can we recapture the fragments? And if it comes with poetry, because poetry has got that poignant force to capture those fragments. I'm fascinated by that idea. It really helps us also to even decolonizing practices, because we are unwittingly reinscribing the logic, colonial modern logics that we set forth to unsettle. I think that is where you headed to. I'd like to make one comment here, and I'll pass on to my questions. That is, you are dwelling much on this identity politics, but from a new way of thinking, whereby we can bring about this rhizomatic kind of thinking, which is interesting. But how can we also attend to the political economy of these confluences of differences in terms of understanding what they allow, what kind of connectivities do they allow and do they disallow? So what about the economy? As we know it, as much as it has done so many things for us, post-colonial studies, because it dwelt on this, identitarian politics too much. What about this, the materiality of these differences? Because of the scaffolding of your presentation, in which I think Fanon is depicted mainly as methodic, rational, as somebody who would like to try to unveil, to uncover, to render something transparent. And in terms of the question of diversity and politics of politics, I would like to quote some quotations from Black Skin, White Masks. For instance, he says, I quote, "I shall be derelict. I leave methods to botanists and mathematicians. There is a point at which methods devour themselves." So how do we account for this kind of critique of European reasoning? And in terms of critique of transparency, he says this: "I am fixed, having adjusted their microtomes, they objectively cut away slices of my reality. I am laid bare." So this is quite a critique of transparency. And he said, in the coming sentences, he even really, literally demands for opacity. Mm-hmm. I quote, "I slip into corners. I remain silent. I strive for anonymity, for invisibility. Look, I will accept the lot as long as no one notices me." So what do you want to do with these kinds of, Fanon's ideas? And in terms of appreciating freedom and diversity, what he said was, quote, all I wanted was to be a man among other men. I wanted to come light and young into a world that was ours and to help to build it together, which is pretty much akin to what Glissant has to say. At last, in relation to politics of politics, Glissant himself really directs us to pay attention to the conclusion of Black Skin, White Masks. And there, Fanon says, quote, I should constantly remind myself that the real leap consists in introducing invention into existence. The coming sentence is even more fascinating. In the world through which I travel, I am endlessly creating myself. If not poetry, this is poesis par excellence. So he doesn't just talk about the future, but the future of future, and which is unseen circumstance, as Glissant would have it. So how would you like to react to these Fanon's ideas? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great questions and observations, and probably in some cases may not be able to completely give you an accurate answer. What we do with, I love the questions. I mean, the difficulty actually is another source of difficult thinking and coming at them. When you say, for example, how do we think about political economy through a rhizomatic thinking, a thinking that's not just in one place, that keeps moving. But also, Glissant raised this particularly in the Caribbean discourse, these ideas. He raised them because Glissant, he raised his difficulty with Marshall McLuhan, the Gutenberg theory, difficulty with Marcuse and many post-Frankfurt thinkers, and Frankfurt thinkers too, who, as a post, because I was thinking about Habermas, but Frankfurt thinkers who trusted modernity to eventually come to include the oppressed minorities or gender, a woman, and so on. And then he actually criticized, many people don't want to read this, Deleuze and Guattari, because his thinking is very much hand in hand with Deleuze and Guattari. The rhizomatic thinking, he goes along with rhizomatic thinking all the way to the nomadism, not nomad in arrow, that is going in straight arrow, but nomadism moving in circle from environment to environment without destroying them, using them, and then moving into another environment without owning them, without creating territory. What was very important to Glissant is that the opposition between land or landscape and territory. A territory gives rise to nationalism, to possession, to ownership, to discrimination, once you say territory. Whereas land is, like in this nomadic thinking, is something that we create solidarity with because we need the land to produce this, or we need to give this to the land. So you don't see land as landscape, even though my only choice for translation, I'm saying landscape, whereas when you say in English, landscape, people see something beautiful, this and that. But he means land as place that you create a new aesthetic approach to. So Glissa in the Caribbean discourse was always, this is why he asked for independence, by the way. He said, we have more in common with the other Caribbean countries than we do with France. But we import everything from France. How can you have a culture if you don't produce? So production was very, very, I mean, this is part of Elizabeth's question also. Production was very important in order to sustain a nation. But if it's a nation that's only consuming, then they don't have a culture. Consuming and then calling your own country in a tropical country. You talk about Martinique in terms of winter, summer, spring, and fall, when actually they only have 1-2 seasons. So Glissa wanted production. And the idea of a production that not only sustain the political economy that you're talking about, but production that also give you a leeway for self-determination, and then enable you, give you choice to relate to Haiti, to Jamaica, and even to the Americas. New Orleans, it's a place that he liked. And he also loved Peru. And he thought that there was a relation between the mountain of Peru and the Mount Pelée in Martinique. So the political economy there, he is not talking about it, but definitely it is in his mind. He's dealing with it by looking at production, by at the base and who owns it. It basically is saying that Martinique, and if they only consume at the level of the superstructure, they get even the water, drinking water from France, then there is something wrong. So which in itself is already political. If you want Elizabeth, it could be ideological, but it's already political. Then I think your idea of Fanon as a poet, I completely agree with you. As imaginative, I completely as I said, the conclusion, black skin, white mask. And Fanon always endlessly recreating himself. I completely agree with you. You know, in dealing with this concept of deopacification, which is used once or twice in Wretched of the Earth, I wanted, on the one hand, in the back of my mind, maybe that kind of determined the project. I wanted to say, oh, I didn't know Glissa used this word. I'm really amazed that he's using literally deopacification, and then Fanon, and then Glissa is using opacity, the right to opacity. So I wanted to look at the way those two words are playing against each other in many ways. But there is no doubt about Fanon's writing, his writing style in French, and the beauty of it. I mean, if you look at two words, just two words, that made the 14 for writers like Homi Baba, the Black experience. Fanon says the Black experience is ambiguous, ambivalent, and diverse. You know, so if you look at the whole idea of ambivalence in Homi Baba, he's playing with Fanon. So Fanon opened the door to those kind of multiplicities. I don't mean to downplay those. If I did, because of the draft of the paper, Fanon gave us a lot of critical. Well, I think for me, the most important contribution of Fanon, beside literally sacrificing his life to the Algerian Revolution, was that he taught us how to think and how to challenge dialectics coming from Europe sometimes. You know, so he taught us how to think that way, and also I think how to make us visible. I think you mentioned that in your question directly, what European civilization and culture reify us, slowly make us disappear. We only become what they want us to be. So Fanon helps us to talk about ourselves. That's why when I came to the United States, 1973, if I tell you, I mean, Salah has this kind of similar experiences, I'm sure. So first, Black studies had just started in the United States in '69. So, and before that, there was the Black Panther movement. Black Panther movement, Fanon was at the center of thought. Black studies, Fanon, you know, when I took my first classes in the United States, Fanon was at the center of thought. And then when I began teaching, and my PhD, people were talking about in the 80s about post-structuralism. Fanon was again at the center of the debate. So I don't mean to freeze Fanon into one type of thinking and then elevate Glissant as a rhizomic thinker. But what is important to me is the richness of Glissant's concept of opacity. So I wanted to talk more about that opacity and rights, opacity and ethics, opacity of, if possible, some kind of politics, opacity and identity and becoming, and so on. Yes, so it's an important and difficult question that one could write a whole article on Fanon's poetry, really, you know, to be honest with you.
Thank you so much, Manthia. If you don't mind, the three of you, that I'm going to move to some of the questions that are from the earlier session, but also from other people who just joined. Some of them are actually answered in the kind of question that have been asked, and I think you gave a good satisfactory answer. There is one that's actually related, since you mentioned Black studies, is from Nidhi Mahajan, who said, thanks for your incredible talk and this conversation. I have a question about, suddenly it shifted somewhere, so just give me a second, because there are other questions coming. I have a question about the politics of refusal, which is becoming a popular mode of thinking in some Black studies circles. Do you see this? Do you see this as part of the legacy of Glissant, or is it different, or is it from a different formation?
Well, in many ways, Glissant's thoughts have companion thinkers. Glissant himself named some, you know, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Kamal Braithwaite. I mean, he has this job in Caribbean discourse where he says the real actualization of the negritude, the kind of Blackness that negritude wanted to describe, came 30 years later with Kamal Braithwaite and the Rastafarian. That, you know, they were the real negritude, whereas the negritude movement itself was too generalizing. They were talking about an Africa that didn't exist. They were talking about a Caribbean that didn't exist. But finally, we began to see the lived experience of that Caribbean through the Rastafarian and through Kamal Braithwaite. Glissant in Black studies is relatively new. It's relatively new. Michael Dash, my former colleague at NYU here, translated the Caribbean discourse into English. And this translation is about 250 pages, whereas the full length of Caribbean discourse is literally 800 pages. So you're reading excerpts that Glissant and Michael agreed on to translate, but it doesn't give a full account of this very complex work. And therefore this is not a critique. This is saying that therefore Glissant's ideas did not enter Black studies except through Black British cultural studies. If you look at people like Stuart Hall, you have a lot of Glissant's ideas there. But the problem is, even Stuart Hall was first in cultural studies before really becoming a major figure in Black studies. Because again, for complex reasons in Black studies around notions of essentialism, notions of a return narrative that we were talking about, roots and authenticity and all these things, for all of which people like Stuart Hall would have been disqualified in the evolution of Black studies until recently, until the 80s or the 90s and 2000. So Gleason's ideas, it's really, it's an interesting question, because if you look at Black studies today, particularly the work of Fred Moten, if you look at Black studies today in what, or several, in the relation to art history, aesthetics, art, Gleason is becoming a major figure. And it's ironic that these people become major in the English-speaking world before they are known in their own native world at all. You know, Fanon was completely ignored in France when Fanon was he was the master thinker in the United States, in Caribbean. Every revolution went through Fanon. Césaire, the same way. You go to Dakar, people could recite all of Césaire's poems by heart in Dakar, but in Martinique, that was not very obvious. And Gleason also is the same way. His theories of the two monde that are called one world in relation. It's the last 10, 15 years that is becoming more and more known, because important poets and literary critics that, like I mentioned, people like Fred Moten, Angela Davis, and so on, they are taking the idea of multiplicity, the idea of this diversity, opacity seriously. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, but I must add something, Manthia, because I think you have a sense of humility sometimes, that is your film itself also, and your writing really made it also more popular. And I think its introduction, this idea of the poetics of relations, opacity and so on, came through your wonderful film, which I encourage everybody to really see, because in and of itself is a piece of artwork, but also the way it really made it accessible, and many people, exhibits, whole biennials, they started to take the name of the poetics of relations. So let me go back to the question. There's a question from Chika that says, is opacity the antithesis of regimes of self-certainty that undergird imperial modernist ideologies and politics and its aftermath?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I think both Chika and Gleason say these things more eloquently than I do. But this is what Gleason is going after. These filiative ideas. When you read Faulkner, Mississippi, what Gleason is trying to do is really to attack these very ideas of originality, of authenticity, of filiation, legitimacy, and therefore transparency. And therefore I own you. I own you because I understand you. I own you because I have your territory, and so on. So yes, absolutely. Opacity is, because of its subversive way of always creating the diverse when you don't expect it, is undermining these imperialist ideas of originality, of legitimacy, because opacity, in a way, I think Gleason, Elizabeth's question earlier, it's hard because what Gleason, if you read, if you see my collected poem videos on Gleason, he is literally saying that all ideologies are failed, and those like capitalism that have not failed, they will eventually fail. You know, he thinks that all ideologies will fail and ends with capitalism. Gleason is also he let me throw some jargons here that Gleason like to use. That is the other of theory. So you have theory that, let's say, Chika is just saying, this imperialist, colonizing idea that is trying to define the world with a language. You know, I was giving the example in the schoolyard in Bamako. If they catch you speaking French, an African language, they put a slate on you and they say you are a donkey. And I'm sure this happened to, I know it in all the Francophone countries, but I'm sure that it happened in other areas of the world. So if you look at that, and you look at what Gleason is trying to do with opacity, it's more than subversion, but it's also a politics of the new world. It's a politics of this new and conversion world that, you know, again, I think, you know, it came up both in Surafel and Elizabeth, when Surafel talked about how can you create a political economy through rhizomic thinking, keep moving all the time, or Elizabeth question about ideology, you know. But Gleason was creating I don't want to call it, here is what Chamoiseau calls it. He calls it poesept. So poesept has the word poetry in it, and sept has the word concept in it. So he was creating concepts that because he doesn't want them to be too strong, colonizing, he called, Patrick Chamoiseau called them poecepts. So Gleason was creating those. So definitely very political in that sense, because it's forcing conceptualization, politicking itself to take poetry into account, to have some point, and that shouldn't be difficult if we look at our political leaders and other people. So Gleason has the other of theory. This is the point. The other of theory is after theory had defined you, the way Surafel is talking about Fanon, talking about Europe, or Chika talking about imperial ideology. After theory has defined you, what are the other things that theory is not seeing? And Gleason said that other of theory is what interests him. He wants to look for the other of theory. And then I think he had concepts like that. So the other of theory, at least 2 or 3 concepts that he plays with, and they are difficult for me to the counter poetics. You know, counter poetics is this way of saying no. The counter poetics is the shout, like the ring shout in Black culture. How they shout become language. You know, when you say no, or if you put words together, Black Lives Matter, which everybody seemed to have been confused with, and then after the death of George Floyd, it becomes language right away. It went from being nonsense. What do they mean by Black Lives Matter? Does that mean that our lives don't matter? And suddenly it became a very eloquent discussion, and it becomes something fearful. If you look at the news every day, one senator just said, if there were Black people with Black Lives Matter at the House of Congress, he would have been threatened. But these were white people, so he was not threatened at all. So, you know, that's the sort of thing that we're dealing with when the shout becomes an eloquent sentence, Black Lives Matter, or the ring shout, or saying no. When that becomes a sentence, it will not only illuminate people, and this is something that Gleason says about opacity too. It will not only illuminate them, but it will also threaten people who are holding the hegemonic discourse. Because suddenly this has become something very articulate, very clear in our mix. I see Salah holding his head, so I stop there.
No. Actually, it's just an amazing how there is a whole set of questions here, and I'm just wondering if we have more few minutes, or I think because they early gave us about 15 minutes, and I think it is about to be over. I think one should end with this. I think these words are very eloquent. I'm so sorry, there's just so many questions there are interesting, but I think perhaps some of them know you, or maybe in the future will bring you back in some way or another. But really, thank you. I mean, there is a lot of questions and issues that have been raised, and I think if we talk about our time, I think the failure to recognize the right to opacity, I think, and I'm just thinking about what Elizabeth Giorgis had just said, but I think her question is that Ethiopia is in her mind at the time now, Ethiopia of today, which is how is the failure of the ruling elite to recognize diversity, to recognize the difference. It should be a blessing and not a curse.
That's right.
And so these are things that, and I think if I have to just add something simple, there is a lot of there's valuable lessons to learn from this kind of mode of thinking that Manthia and all the people who interacted with you, is that we are almost at a time of a second coming. I mean, when we really think about the state of the world, and that part of the world that concerns us, which is the state of post-colonial Africa or the Black world.
Right.
I mean, there is something promising about it, because there is a rebellion against those failed elite in recognizing that right to opacity in the practical way. But also, of course, it is rooted in the colonial structures and what the post-colonial state inherited, even the failure of those who are progressive. You look at the state of Algeria or Sudan, after so much beautiful revolutions, then you end up with militia, militarized, coming of the military and so forth. But I think that should also renew hope rather than really despair, because when I think about it, is that it points us to something that's important in the idea of opacity, which is democracy and human rights.
That's
that
right.
all regimes, nationalist regimes, fail to recognize this. And
you're right, because all the differences are equal. You're completely right there. The smallest difference to the largest difference become equal. So you're right, democracy and human rights. You're absolutely right.
So I would think of them, but I will just add one thing, is that the failure also had to do with the weakness of a civil society and civic engagement.
Yeah.
That is where there is a need for a new type of consciousness. And perhaps we are at the cusp of a change of paradigm that can make that shift, that can make us think that the engagement of the average, of the everyone, which is in the kind of the idea of a civil society, that perhaps will rescue us. And I think what is happening now is perhaps the beginning, or maybe the climax of that consciousness that will lead us to some form of new coming or new becoming. So at this point, I would like to thank you all, and thank also Surafel, Elizabeth, Manthia on top of all, and all the people who engaged with us in questions. And I apologize to many who raised so many questions, which I think there will be other chances to answer. But I want to thank again Noura, Al-Qasimi, Nawar, and Wasan, Sana, all of the people who work behind the scene to make this a success. So thank you, and good evening, good morning, or wherever you are in this world, or good afternoon.
Thank you, Manthia.